Hi guys, today I'm showing you how to make nesting baskets. And if you've been on my channel before, you might have seen my original video on this, which tells you how to make nesting baskets that have a fold over edge. This one is a updated version of that has more of a square basket that doesn't need to have the edge folded over. And it also has this edge around here that looks like bias binding, but it's actually just the liner. And I'm going to show you a trick for doing that. So for this video, I have all of the sizes prepped and ready with each of the individual steps, so it will be a little bit easier to see what they're supposed to look like at each step before you actually do the sewing part. So for this video, I'm starting with the smallest size, and we'll start with this and I'll walk you through all of the steps for making a basket from start to finish. I have a printable chart that has all of the sizes in here, and it tells you what size you need to cut everything out. But for this one, I also made templates that you can print out, so if you want to use these instead of the chart, this is just a fun way to sort of have more of a visual. So the download for this is in my Ko-fi shop, and I will leave a link for this in the description. It comes with the chart and the templates, so you can do whatever method works better for you. For your materials, you only need fabric and batting. And for each one of these, you're going to need an outer fabric and a liner fabric. This probably isn't obvious from the video, but the liner is cut a 1/4 inch taller than the outer fabric, and that is on purpose so that the fabric can fold around the top edge here to create that false bias binding. So I already have these cut out for the video, but to do the cutting part, it really helps to have a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter, and then some kind of quilting cutting mat like this. And aside from that, you're just going to want some sharp fabric scissors and, of course, a sewing machine and an iron. But other than that, that's really all you need to make these. So the first step to make these is to cut out your fabric, and like I said, you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric for the liner and 2 pieces for the outer. You'll also need some pieces of batting, and these we're going to trim down to size after quilting on here because it's a lot easier to do that afterwards. So for your batting, you'll either want to use fusible fleece, which has an adhesive on it already, and you just press it on with your iron, and your instructions will come with the package that you bought. Or you can use an adhesive like this, which is OTIF 505. It is a basting spray, and you will spray this onto the batting and then press the fabric onto it. And by press, I mean just put it on with your hand. You don't need to iron it on. You do want to spray this on the batting, not on the fabric, because it can show through on the fabric if you're spraying directly on it. And that's just because the spray can be a little bit too intense if you're spraying directly on fabric, but you won't see it when it's on the batting. So you'll just spray this and then you will put the fabric on top of it, and then you can quilt on here. So I'm going to attach my fabric to the batting, and then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to quilt. When you're doing that, make sure that you are only quilting through the outer fabric and the batting. You do not want to quilt through your liner fabrics yet because we need these to be separate. So I don't know if you can really see the stitching super well on the video, but I just did some free motion quilting on here in sort of a wave design, and then I trimmed the fabric down. And as you can see, it's just through the batting and the fabric, and I have my liner pieces separate. So depending on what kind of quilting you want to do, you really don't need a special presser foot for your machine. I did this with a walking foot, so you can get some cool results with just a regular sewing machine foot. If you're not sure what to do or this looks intimidating to you, you can also just quilt in straight lines and call it good. So now that I've done some quilting on here, the next step is just to trim off the batting so that it is flush with the edges of your fabric. To do this, you're going to want a ruler and a rotary cutter. So you can line this up with the grid lines on your cutting mat if you want to, so that I have the fabric lined up here on this edge with the lines on my cutting mat and the edge of my ruler. If you want to, you can also do it at whatever angle is more comfortable for you to cut. For me personally, I don't really bother with lining it up because the fabric is already the right size. So I'm just picking this up and rotating it so that I can cut along the next edge. And then I will do that all the way around. If I was doing this without filming, I would have more room and I would cut along two sides at once, but for the video, I'm just doing one side at a time. So when you're done with that, you'll have a nice piece that's all squared up and ready for the next step. So the next step I'm going to show you with this larger size that I have already prepared. And this step is to attach them so that the liner and the outer fabric are attached at the top. If you have a fabric that is non-directional like this, it doesn't matter which side is technically the top. But if you have a directional print like I do on this fabric, I want these kitties to be at the top so they're not upside down. This one does have kitties going different directions, but since this is at the top of the basket, I want these ones pointing up. So whichever side you want to be at the top of your basket, that is the side that you're going to join with your liner fabric. And to do that, you're going to be laying these pieces right sides together and sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're piecing these together, you will notice that your liner fabric is longer than your outer fabric, and that's on purpose so that we can get that bias binding look on the edge of our basket. So don't worry about that if you see it. It's supposed to be that way. So these pieces are somewhat non-directional, so I'm just going to pick a side and I'm going to lay these together. The most important thing though is that you are sewing along the longer edge. These are not perfect squares, of course, so these shorter edges are the sides of your basket and the longer edge is going to be the top. Just keep that in mind when you're pinning these together. So we're ready to sew these together now. I have them right sides together and they're pinned along the top. And we're just going to take this to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It can help to backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam, but if you forget, it's not the end of the world. After sewing that top edge, the next step is to flip out this liner fabric and we're going to press it with an iron. I'm laying this so that my seam allowance is pointing up towards the liner, and that's because the batting layer is thicker and it's going to lay a lot more nicely that way. You don't want to try fighting with it to press the batting down towards itself. That's not just more difficult, but it also defeats the purpose of having our cute little finished edge when we're done with these. So when you are pressing these, make sure you're pressing by keeping the iron up and down as much as possible, and you're not ironing where you drag the iron across the fabric. It's easier to do this, but doing that can distort your fabric and make it lay at a funny angle, and then your sizes can get off. So as much as possible, just try to press. And if you want to, you can also use starch on here if that's easier for you, or even just spraying it with water or using a steam setting on your iron. And then that is going to lay really nice and flat. After ironing these, the next step is kind of a 2-in-1 step. We're going to be laying these pieces so that the liner fabrics are together and the outer fabrics are together. And we want to make sure that that center seam is really nice and lined up in the middle. And then I like to put a quilting clip in the middle to hold that in place. So for a visual on what this step is going to look like, I have one of my larger basket sizes here. I have it clipped all the way around with these quilting clips, and I've cut out the corners in each of the 4 corners. The size that you cut the corners is going to be in the chart, so you can just refer to that. So for my little basket, I'm going to add a few more clips around the outside, and that's just going to keep these layers from shifting around. You don't want to put them too close to the corners themselves because we do need room to cut. This is the smallest basket, so the corner size is going to be 1 inch that we cut out of here. And I'm using a quilting ruler to cut this out to the right size. I'm going to line up my ruler in the corner so that my 1-inch line is lined up with my fabric. And then I like to draw on here with a heat erasable pen, and I'm just going to mark where my corner is. So I'm just rotating my piece around so that I can trace the corner on each one of these. The blue pen probably doesn't show up super well on the video for you, but you can see what I have traced on here on the batting. So what we're going to do now is take a sharp pair of sewing scissors, and you're going to cut out each of these corners. And when you do this, you can cut through both layers at the same time. You don't really want to use a rotary cutter for this step because it's way too easy to cut too far into it, and then you're going to have these little cut marks in your corners that you don't want. So I'm just taking my scissors and I'm going to cut all of those corners out. When you're doing this, just try your best to keep the fabric from shifting around, because otherwise your corners will be a little bit uneven. So again, I have one of my larger sizes here to show you what this is going to look like after we sew it. This is probably the most complicated step, but it's really not difficult once you understand how to do it. So what you're going to do is start sewing a little ways down from the center seam, and you're going to start here, sew all the way down the edge, and then when you get to this bottom corner here, you'll put your needle in the fabric, lift up your project, and pivot it so that you are looking at this edge. And then you're just going to keep sewing along the bottom. Then when you get to this corner, you'll put the needle in the fabric again, pivot your project, and then keep sewing up this side. And then you'll actually keep going all the way down to this corner in the bottom of the liner. You'll do your pivot again, pivot here, and then here is the important part. We do need to leave a gap in the liner so that you can turn the basket right side out when you are done. And to do that, you're just going to stop about and half an inch to an inch, and you're going to backstitch and stop sewing. And then the size of the gap is going to vary depending on what size of basket you're making, but it should just be enough that you can reach in there and you can turn the basket after we're done sewing it. So I'm going to take my little basket to the machine and we're going to start sewing right here. Do that process of going all the way around, and then I'm going to stop right here so I have a little bit of a gap to turn my basket. And here's how that little guy is going to look after sewing around the sides and the bottom. And I have my gap in the side here for turning it when we're done. The next step is going to be sewing across the corners. So I have one of my larger baskets here to show what this is going to look like. We're basically just folding out the corners and then pinning along that raw edge, and we're going to sew all 4 of the corners. You're going to do this in the liner and the outer fabric. And like all the other seams on this bag, we are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The most important part of this is just having it so that your seam allowance is pointing in opposite directions. So on here, I have my seam pointing this way, and this one is pointing to the right. And that is just going to make your seams lay a little bit more neatly on your finished bag. So you don't need to cut that thread in the middle. It's actually going to just serve as a guide for keeping your corners lined up nicely. So I just have my fabric and I'm opening it out so that this is forming a straight line along here. And then I'm taking one seam allowance and pushing it to the left and one and pushing that one to the right. And then these should be nested in the middle here. And when you're doing this, you'll get a feel for what that is supposed to be. But basically, the seams will be lined up perfectly together. This one is so small that I'm just going to put one quilting clip in here. But if you have larger sizes, just use as many quilting clips as you need. This can be a little bit bulky in the bottom, so if you don't want that much thickness in your seams, you can definitely trim down the batting. But if you do that, just make sure you're not trimming your seams themselves and make sure you're not trimming too close. So now we're just going to take this to the machine and sew across these. And you do want to make sure that you're back stitching at the beginning and the end so it's nice and secure. So at this point, we're almost done, and the last step is just to turn the basket right side out, and we're going to be sewing this opening closed with an invisible ladder stitch. To make that a little easier, I have one of the larger baskets here to show you that I have this opening pressed down to the wrong side by about a 1/4 inch on both sides of the opening. So that's creating this nice crisp line, and that is going to make sewing it together a lot easier. I'm just going to turn this, and then we're going to press that and sew it closed with an invisible ladder stitch. So it's going to look a little frumpy at this point, but we're going to be pressing it afterwards, and I promise it's going to look a lot cuter after that. But you can already sort of see this effect that we're getting with the liner coming around to the outside to create that false bias binding. And that is why we cut the liner a little bit taller so that it could do this without stretching out and not laying nicely in the bottom of the basket. So I'm just going to sort of press this down to create a nice smooth line, and then I'm going to sew that closed. You can do it on your sewing machine, but I personally think it looks better to do an invisible ladder stitch on here by sewing by hand. So to press this liner opening here, I just have it folded kind of roughly to the inside, and then I'm going to sort of hold those together and lay this on my ironing board and then just sort of press that. So I normally wouldn't use red thread for this. I would use black so it matches better, but it's pretty impossible to see that in the video. So I just have my needle threaded and I have a knot at the end. So I'm going to take my threaded needle and I'm going to poke it underneath this seam allowance from the wrong side to the right side so that it's coming up on the right side. Maybe a little bit tricky to see on the video, but this little mushroom here is on my seam allowance and I'm just going to the right side. Then I'm going to take my opening and I'm going to pinch it so that the edges are lined up. And then I'm just going to catch the fabric on one side of this opening for about 1/8 of an inch along that fold and have my needle come out in the fold of the fabric. And then I will pull my thread through, and then on the opposite side here, I'm going to put the needle in the fold of the fabric and do the same thing, catching about 1/8 of an inch and then pulling the thread through. You're just going to repeat this across the entire opening by catching a little bit of thread on one side and then on the other. And that's just going to create a really nice smooth finish on here that you're really not going to notice on the inside of your basket. So here I have my seam completely sewn together and I'm at the end, so I tied a knot at the end here and I'm just going to cut my thread off. So you're just going to push the lining back into the basket and then we are going to press this with an iron. What you want to do is make sure that this liner piece is coming up outside of the basket by a 1/4 inch all the way around, and then you can press the lip of the basket with your iron. If you want to, you can also sort of reach in here and press from the outside to straighten out these seams and make them lay nice and neat. If you're doing that with your hand inside, just make sure your iron is on a low enough setting where it's not going to get too hot and burn you. So after ironing the basket, it's starting to look a lot neater. And the last step is just to do some top stitching along here to hold the liner nicely in place. The reason I made the smallest basket for the video is that this step is actually a little bit challenging on the smallest size, and you do need to do a little bit of a different technique for this size versus the larger sizes. And that's because this opening is not big enough for most machines where you can put this over the free arm of your sewing machine. Unlike the larger sizes of the basket where this obviously will fit over your machine. For this stage, you are going to see your thread more than any other part of the project. So if you care about having it match, you do want to switch your top thread and your bobbin thread because both of them are going to show on your basket. You can either do this where you have the presser foot kind of on the inside of the basket and sew around, or you can sort of manipulate the basket so that it's flat against here enough that you can sew it without actually being around your free arm of your machine. Either way, what you want to be doing is sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge. If you want to be super precise, you can sew right in this little line here between the fabrics where they meet, and this would technically be a technique called stitching in the ditch. Or you can sew on the liner fabric itself if you don't want to be that precise. It can be a little bit fiddly to do it that way, so whatever way you want to do is up to you. And here is how the basket looks after doing the top stitching around the outside. I really like the stitch in the ditch method because you honestly can't really see the stitching at all, but it is there and it keeps your basket looking nice and neat. So on the inside, there's just a simple 1/4 inch seam allowance on here. And then on the front, it looks like you did bias binding, but you didn't have to do any of the work to make it look so cute. So I hope you enjoyed making these baskets with me. I would love to hear how it went in the comments. And again, you can find that printable chart and the templates in my Ko-fi shop. So I will leave a link for that below. Thanks for watching and happy sewing.